The present times have been difficult. But we have been here before.
Reconstruction is the least understood period of American history and one of the most important.
What Black people from the South lived under was autocracy.
I do believe that the narrative struggle that surrounded slavery was the great struggle that we have not confronted. And that narrative was rooted in this false claim that Black people aren't as good as white people. Black people are less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved. And that narrative triumphed over our commitment to the rule of law. And that's why Reconstruction collapses. That leads to thousands of lynchings. It leads to the codification of racial hierarchy and segregation. And I think it held our country back in some pretty profound ways. Understanding what went wrong during that period after the Civil War has implications for what we do today.
We have always taken direction in our own freedom, and it starts with Reconstruction. And so if we don't learn that as a people, how are we to understand how we can navigate the political moment that we're in now?
It was a critical time in American history when the whole future of this country could have shifted in a very different direction.
It was a time of great first. We remade ourselves as a country. It was during the Reconstruction era, after the end of slavery, that we made the effort to constitutionally make America into a multiracial society. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment is the real powerhouse because it gave us equal protection and due process under the laws. It also introduced something that's quite a bit discussed now, birthright citizenship, that for any persons born or naturalized in America are American citizens. I mean, there was a big question at the end of slavery. No longer enslaved, but does that make you an American citizen? Well, the 14th Amendment answered that question, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. It's important that we understand the roots. The 15th Amendment gave, at least at that point in time, Black men the right to vote, which was extraordinary, given what the country had been for the previous 200, almost 50 years.
You know, it was so inspiring to see formerly enslaved people start schools and start churches and commit to education and commit to voting, get elected to local leadership positions, coming to Congress. It was that brief window when we saw what America might have been a century earlier.
But the law can only go so far, and it doesn't necessarily legislate or change the hearts.
Once Abraham Lincoln was killed and his vice president Johnson comes along, Johnson was intellectually and ideologically like antithetical to Lincoln. And so you get the progress that slavery has ended, and then there's the attempt to reconstruct, but Johnson doesn't want us reconstructed.
So it's in that environment that the opportunity to succeed gets really undermined. And then that gets aggravated by violence. The use of terror violence and lynching was the way in which this compliance with racial hierarchy was maintained.
Always, always pushback.
Wilmington, North Carolina was an example of it. In the year 1898, there was a successful coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina. It was a white supremacist insurrection. At the time, Wilmington had a biracial government. African Americans in Wilmington were fairly prosperous relatively. They owned businesses, banks. They were able to send their kids to college. A wonderful example of what Reconstruction was meant to be able to do. And this is extraordinary because these are individuals who are scarcely a generation outside of having been enslaved for over 200 years. Well, this drew a backlash. a group of vigilantes who had ties with the former Confederacy attacked this government. They introduced it with all kinds of misinformation and disinformation to get the people whipped up. And ultimately, they told the editors of the black newspaper to get out of town. They told the black businesses to get out of town or else. And when the or else came, they descended on them all. They burned down their businesses. They killed untold numbers of them. They drove a great many into the woods, into the swamps and the forests where they had to hide for their lives. And they replaced that government with former Confederates. It to me is an account that can teach us a lot about the rule of law, the importance of maintaining the rule of law, what we become when we do not honor the rule of law. And as well, there probably are parallels that many can draw with some of the current day issues and concerns where this has happened before. Democracy doesn't work without a functioning judiciary. Democracy is nothing more than a series of rules and laws and principles that we have universally embraced as a people in our democratic republic. And when that's not honored and when that's not respected, the alternative is chaos.
My colleague, Jelani Cobb, who is the Dean of Journalism at Columbia University, talks about how if you understood Reconstruction, you would have understood how President Trump got elected the first time. Because every time there's progress, then there's pushback. And so for people who were so surprised in 2016, his analysis was that clearly they did not understand the 1860s and the 1870s.
Right after the Civil War, the court had the ability to insist on full enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendment. You know, there was that short period where there was a willingness on the part of the federal government to use federal prosecutors to hold accountable anyone that committed violence against formerly enslaved people. We had something called the Ku Klux Klan Act to restrict racial violence. Had those laws been enforced, I think we'd have a very different future. It was the Supreme Court that said, no, we're going to prioritize states' rights over these federal constitutional provisions. And those decisions in the civil rights cases, in those 1870s and 1880s cases, that basically restricted the federal government from the kind of enforcement, I think that was the thing that created most of the harm. Then, of course, Congress was limited in what it could do. I mean, Congress passed several civil rights laws that could have made a difference. And with the Supreme Court ruling the way it did, it just undermined all of that.
The judiciary is the backbone. We are the guardians of the rule of law, the guardians of the Constitution. The laws also speak to our values.
Once the Supreme Court made those rulings and empowered these people who believed in white supremacy, who believed in racial hierarchy, and then they took over and the federal troops were withdrawn, then we saw a collapse of any chance of equality and justice prevailing.
Reconstruction did have its successes, but it was ultimately attacked and defeated. It didn't fail. It brought about quite a backlash. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, there was a great deal of racial violence and terror. The laws were, to some extent during that era too, weaponized. The courts at that time declared that the 14th Amendment did not extend to private conduct. And you can see how that was the precursor to ultimately the segregation era. The other thing that was critical was the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877 when he was in a battle for the presidency against his opponent Tilden. And as a compromise for the support of the South, Hayes agreed that if elected he would withdraw the federal troops, which were there helping to enforce the newly minted constitutional rights. And so the troops were withdrawn.
And that's why Reconstruction collapses. That leads to thousands of lynchings. It leads to the codification of racial hierarchy and segregation. And I think it held our country back in some pretty profound ways.
Slavery itself existed in America for almost 250 years. And then we had, after that, the period of Jim Crow, the separate but equal, culminating in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. That period lasted another 100 years. I mean, if there were a bridge that were blown up, we wouldn't say the bridge failed, unless we were trying not to say it was blown up.
It is one of the most misunderstood time periods in the nation. And if you go to the African American Smithsonian in DC, it is the smallest exhibit. And now, in certain states in the country, the topic of Reconstruction has been banned and been made illegal. And it's so important to understand it because it's the moment when African Americans become citizens and then fight towards justice.
Formerly enslaved people were remarkable. You know, they could have said, we want retribution and revenge against the people who enslaved us, who separated us. But they chose instead citizenship. They chose instead family. They chose faith. They chose education. And so they were model citizens in virtually every respect. But then they were undermined. They were disenfranchised. They were forced back into labor conditions that were exploitative and abusive. They were denied equal treatment, and then they were excluded from all of the opportunities for social and cultural advantage through Jim Crow.
Slavery was quickly replaced in the South with the system of either debt peonage, where you were forced to work on the plantations to, in quotes, pay off your debts, or sharecropping. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, wasn't realized, and that was an institution that lasted for the next at least 100 years, and to some extent even thereafter. My father in Georgia grew up as a sharecropper on the same land where the plantation had been, where he and my ancestors had been enslaved. And it spoke to the limits of opportunities and the lack of access to land that one could own after the period of enslavement.
I mean, you have to remember that the people in power were still largely the people that tried to succeed from the government. The land was still owned by that white confederacy. The power, the economic power, was still in the control of these people who had fought to succeed. And so there was a limit on what formerly enslaved people could do. Some historians have called this new system worse than slavery because at least when people were enslaved, that there was an economic interest in making sure that they were fed sufficiently, that they stayed alive to do the work. Without that investment, they lost that protection. And so things like convict leasing and other systems emerged where when someone died, they were just replaced. It wasn't a personal loss to any one enslaver or one white landowner. And so I do think that phenomenon where we didn't accommodate the economic needs and we didn't create land and opportunities for wealth for formerly enslaved people left that population vulnerable to these same dynamics. So it's in that environment that the opportunity to succeed gets really undermined. And then that gets aggravated by violence. The use of terror violence and lynching was the way in which this compliance with racial hierarchy was maintained.
This was a case that involved what is referred to as an exhibition lynching in Duluth, Minnesota, at the time an overwhelmingly white town. A traveling circus came through that town. In the traveling circus were a number of young, early 20s African-American circus workers. They were in town for one night, and there was a young woman who claimed that she had been raped and accused one of these traveling circus workers. Well, once the story kind of spread, the whole town was whipped up. The circus workers were apprehended, and that night this mob broke into the police station, dragged out a number of the accused, and then hung three of them from a lamppost. Then they took the kind of exhibition photos and that's what's remarkable about it, all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of people, they're smiling and grinning and pointing with this grisly scene in the middle of them. of the 3 murdered young African American men. Max Mason was among them. He was not lynched, but he was ultimately then tried for what was proven to be a fictitious rape, widely accepted to be a fictitious rape. But Max Mason nonetheless was convicted of this. The evidence could not have been flimsier. And it stood for 100 years. Max Mason was sent to hard labor in Stillwater Prison and was ultimately released and exonerated after spending so many years there from the prison, but he was banished from the state. That he was released on the condition he never returned to the state of Minnesota. It was a travesty. The 3 young black men who were lynched, nobody knew what happened to them. The bodies were simply put someplace in unmarked graves, and they only figured out where they were buried, in all likelihood, some 50 years later.
Our people have been engaged in this struggle forever. And black people, when you look at the history of America or Minnesota, but it's been that courageous group of black people who knew what they needed to do to open doors and make it possible, and they did it. We have, a history of strong, courageous black men and women in Minnesota who believed in equal opportunity and justice and fought for it.
And we're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of that lynching. So I took on the case to right a wrong. It was important to me to vindicate the name of Max Mason, but even more important, the rule of law. For it was an instance where it didn't work properly, where any number of persons involved, from the prosecutor's office to the judge, acknowledged that this should not have happened. But there wasn't anybody who was prosecuted and convicted for the murder of the 3 murdered young African American men. We as individuals agree that we will not resort to the law of the wild or to self-help and so on, because we trust that our systems will work, that the democracy will work, that it will be fair, that it will be equitable, that it will be just. And when it's not, the wheels come off.
Judge Hastings once talks about democracy can never be fully won, but it can be lost. Yeah. And I think about this idea, the dynamic of love of one another. Mm-hmm. This space about how we create this concept of love for one another to move us forward. Is there lessons to be learned within our community and to give to others within that space?
I think there are. I mean, I think we talk a lot about the harm and the trauma and the violence and the victimization and the degradation. And I think we need to understand all of that, because we don't have a detailed understanding of the harm. We're not going to appreciate the courage. We're not going to appreciate the strength and all the amazing things that allowed people to overcome that. But the other side of the story is that despite the violence, despite the victimization, despite the threats, the intimidation, enslaved people in the United States had this remarkable commitment to perseverance, to surviving, to overcoming. Enslaved people in America learned to love in the midst of agony. When you know that your child could be sold at any moment and you'd never see your child again, it'd be rational to not love that child so much that your heart is just shattered when they're taken away. But enslaved black people in this country did the opposite. They held on to their children. They held on to their siblings. They held on to their parents, their loved ones, their partners, and they fought for them even when they knew they might be taken away. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved people spent their last nickels and dimes placing ads in newspapers around the region looking for children sold away 20 years earlier, partners sold away, parents sold away, siblings sold away. And it speaks to the capacity to love in the midst of suffering that I think is important when you understand this story. I'm the product of enslaved people. All of my 4 parents were enslaved. And yet I'm here because they never gave up on love. They never gave up on a future. They never gave up on the dreams of freedom and opportunity.
And because we believe it and we know the struggle that our ancestors suffered, we're not willing to give up very easily.
Dr. King, when he received the Nobel Prize in 1964, made it very clear that black people in the American South had done what they'd done because we are, quote, a mighty army of love. Those are the words he used to describe the community of people who had enough love to commit to nonviolence, had enough love to commit to the discipline of civil rights activism. And I think that's a powerful frame for understanding what it may take to make more progress. What gives me hope is that if we find the courage to commit to truth-telling, if we have the will to commit to truth-telling, we really shall overcome.
E pluribus unum, from the many, one. The multiracial society that we are, Reconstruction 2.0, the notion that this democratic republic is meant to include all of us under one rule of law, equal justice, and as we say, liberty and justice for all.